Super. Well, kia ora everyone and welcome. Delighted to be bringing this webinar from the team at Grow. My name is Faye Johnson and we're thrilled to be working with Giresh Kanji in bringing this webinar to you on Depression Unmasked. We will be recording this webinar, so you will be sent the link post-event, and we'll also share information on the other upcoming workshops that Giresh is working on and some of our other team as well after the webinar. I would like to start with a karakia before I hand over to Giresh. And please do feel free to ask questions via the chat. So the chat is along the bottom if you're not familiar with it, and you can type a message either to myself that I can feed through to Giresh, or you can put it out to everybody. So, right, I'd like to start with the karakia. So, kia hongi, kia ako, kia taka, kia pono, kia whai, kia tukituki, kia eke, panuku, hui ea, taiki ea. This is asking us for learning to work, for truth and honesty to prevail, for work to be achieved and to be achieved well together. This is our commitment today. And with that, I'd like to hand over to you, Giresh.
Thank you, Faye, and thank you for everyone that's turned up today. So I've been at university 27 years and I did a PhD which finished in 2013, and that looked at stress and pain. And so I looked at all the neurotransmitters and how stress affects pain. And in doing that, I learned about how stress creates symptoms such as insomnia, anxiety, depression. And I think one of the problems we've had is that we haven't quite known the A to Z of insomnia, anxiety, depression. So we haven't really known where to intervene. So we sort of have a good idea, but in order to help our patients, we need to be able to explain it to them clearly so they understand the A to Z of it and they know why they should do certain things to help themselves. And my aim is I'm a clinician, I'm a medical specialist, I'm a pain specialist, and also an honorary associate professor at Auckland University. And my aim is to manage people for life. And I think that's one of the key aspects that I think as clinicians and mental health workers and whoever's in the room, we can't really influence our patients a lot within the short space of time we have them for. And so it's about instilling habits within our patients that will see them in the long term do well. So I'm going to share my screen. So everyone can see that? So in my PhD, I actually use headache and migraine as a model of chronic pain. And I looked at all the aspects of it to see if I could come up with a model that explains all the aspects of it. And then I wrote the book Brain Connections, and it took me about 4.5 years. And so I went into medical literature and looked around at all the different aspects of insomnia, anxiety, depression. I'm going to present the depression stuff today. Because really, if we have an overarching model, we really have to explain all the things we know about it from the medical research. One of the things we know is that we're reasonably poor at managing it. And the average number of major depressive episodes in a lifetime is around 13 for anyone who gets an episode of major depression. Half the people will in fact have an episode for every year of their lives. So it's not really a condition that we get depressed and then, a year later we're not depressed, and then for the rest of our lives we're good. It doesn't seem to follow that course. And that is a real reason why we need to look elsewhere at what we should be doing or advising our patients. So the facts that we know, and I'm going to go through about 10 different slides, and they're they're things that I learnt while writing this book and before that. So firstly, we know that depression correlates well with the activity of our stress nervous system, our sympathetic nervous system. We measure sympathetic nervous system with heart rate variability, and many people with smartwatches, some smartwatches measure this, and it used to be more a university type measurement, but now it is available in the mainstream. But as our heart rate variability goes down, our sympathetic nervous system activity goes up. And so we can measure this, and they've measured this in people who are depressed, and they've found that the sympathetic nervous system tone is elevated. And when people get better, their sympathetic nervous system tone reduces. So there's some reasonable evidence to suggest that and this is what we would expect, you know, as people would think, oh yeah, the more stress you have, the more likely you are to be depressed. And I think that makes common sense. And the studies support that common sense. Now, the real fun started when I started looking around at the human body, and I looked at randomized control trials of groups of people with depression and groups of people without depression. And there were some incredible studies which I wasn't aware of before I wrote the book. So the pituitary gland is a gland in the brain that sparks off the stress chemicals to the adrenal gland and sets things in motion, so to speak. It's found to be 30% increased in size on MRI scan for people who have depression. So, you know, it's quite a big change, and that's compared to people who don't have depression as measured on MRI scans. The adrenal gland, which is a gland that sits above our kidneys and produces stress chemicals, the adrenaline, adrenaline, noradrenaline, and cortisol, is found to be 70% larger in patients with depression on MRI scan, and that's two groups. So it's, you know, it was quite incredible that this is out there, because, and these studies were 15, 20 years old, and they've been replicated as well. The hippocampus, and that's a part of our brain that subserves memory concentration, that's found to be around 20–30% shrunk. And this starts to make sense because we often, with major stress conditions, including depression, we have a brain fog where we forget things, and our memory concentration isn't as good. And this is in a lot of conditions which are stress related, or stress plays a part, like chronic pain syndrome, chronic fatigue syndrome, depression, anxiety, fibromyalgia. They tend to have the brain fog described. And this would correlate well to a reduction in hippocampal volume. Now, the other thing this correlates nicely with is that people with depression have an increased risk of dementia when they age. And what happens as we go from 60 to 90 is that our hippocampus shrinks slowly, and our risk of dementia increases from around 10 in 1,000 to 100 in 1,000 from the age of 60 to 90. Now, if we enter that age group or younger with a slightly smaller hippocampus to start with, we're probably going to be more at risk of developing dementia, which is what the studies show. Now, one of the last pieces of information that I learned while writing the book is that the GABA levels, and GABA is gamma aminobutyric acid, is a neurotransmitter in the brain that turns the brain off. It actually reduces electricity in our brain. And 20% of all the neurons in our brain produce GABA. And what the study and other studies have shown is that GABA levels were 52% reduced in patients with depression compared to patients who don't have depression. So we've got some electrical circuitry going on that's not quite right. The relationship between childhood trauma and depression, I mean, we've sort of looked at it. It's real, and several studies show it. If we have one childhood trauma, our risk of depression and suicide doubles. If we have 4 childhood stressors or trauma, we have 5 times the risk of depression and 12 times the risk of suicide. So there's a real relationship between childhood trauma and the symptoms of depression and suicide. Now, I haven't said it earlier, but the risk between an episode of major depression and suicide, if you have major depression, you're 29 times more likely to have a completed suicide. So, you know, we have a lot of strategies for suicide prevention, but in fact, they don't really work that well, because most people who commit suicide never seek help from a health professional. So it's sort of, we probably need to target the depression a lot more. And hopefully by doing that, we can start reducing the number of people that commit suicide. The other factor also is that people often say, and I see a lot of patients with pain as well as insomnia, anxiety, depression, and they often say, well, look, I had quite a good childhood. While you're in your mother's womb, if the mum is stressed, the cortisol can go across the placental barrier and influence the child, basically the unborn baby's stress system, and can make it bigger. So some people, unfortunately, can be wound up during pregnancy, and so they don't need childhood trauma at all to develop symptoms. In 1970, I had TB, and I was put in this place, which is now the SPCA in Wellington on top of Mount Victoria. And it was 3 months in isolation. I remember a little bit about it, and not much. I just remember not liking it. And my mother used to walk up the Mount Victoria Hill every day because the buses didn't go up the hill, to come and bring me some lunch. I remember that much. A year later, I was involved in an accident in this type of Thames 500. For many of us who are older will remember this shaped truck, and a large car went into the side of the truck. I, in fact, fractured my hip and was in traction for 9 weeks in Wellington Hospital. And ever since that time, probably 3 or 4 days a week, I suffered from nightmares, night sweats, a bit of anxiety, to the age of 40. And it was a very regular nightmares, and some were of abandonment, some were missing exams and all sorts of things, but they were very regular, in fact. And I was a pretty poor sleeper. So a lot of what I've learned over the sort of 27 years at university has benefited me, in fact, to try and change some of those features of my life. We had a couple of siblings die, one in a car accident and one in India, and there was a few other hospitalizations I personally had. So I'd probably had about 8 traumas growing up before I was 15. And so they probably contributed a lot to what happened to me. Some other things that I've learnt is that depression seems to be less likely in warmer climates. And this is from a study which was done in several European cities by the same researchers. And from Santander, Spain, the rate was 1.8%, and Liverpool, it was 15%. And you may argue Liverpool may be a little miserable, although they have cleaned their act up a lot. And I've been there last year, and I went there 20 years ago, and it's certainly a much more vibrant place, but it's certainly much higher. And the same stats, not exactly, but there seems to be more depression in the cities than countryside of the same country, slightly more as well. Now, this is an interesting one. This is the depression prevalence with age. And as you can see from the graph, we increase, during the 20 to 50 age group. And then after 65, it drops off. And in fact, the happiest people in the world are over 65. Now, this would be quite contrary to what we'd imagine, really, because, you might have a bit more health problems when you're older. You may have a bit less money because you're not working. Some argue that you're not working, and that may help a lot. But that's an interesting statistic, and we need to be able to explain this if we sort of look at a model to explain why we get depressed. So here's a sort of model that I've come up with. So early childhood trauma and that's really prolonged stress, any prolonged stress, and it could be in adulthood as well. So I've done some looking at people who go to war, and what's found is people who are deployed in the army versus not deployed have a higher risk of depression afterwards. So, you know, that trauma of going to war and being deployed in the field has its stresses, and usually it's over a prolonged period. So, you know, it may be months. So that, and also if your mother's been stressed and that goes through to the womb, then even at birth you could be born with basically an increased size of your stress nervous system. So we've got a wind up of the sympathetic nervous system and hypothalamic pituitary axis. Hence, for any given input of stress, we produce twice as many stress chemicals. Now, the inputs that wind up or basically create stress chemicals in our brain and body are poor sleep, pain, stress of any type, you know, occupational, family, and concentration. And the concentration is quite an interesting one. So, you know, and you can see students while they're sitting exams at the end of the year as an interesting group of people and patients that have a lot of problems around exam time because of the concentration and the stress of sitting and passing exams, etc. So the concentration, and so long periods of concentration, working really hard, winds up your stress brain. So once you've got a raised stress nervous system, and it's basically, you might have a bigger pituitary gland, bigger adrenal gland, you're going to produce more stress chemicals for any given stressor, and that keeps it wound up pretty much for life. And the first symptoms usually are insomnia, anxiety, and the stress chemicals are designed for the tiger, so we want to be super awake, we want to be anxious, and we also want to be very aggressive. Hence, irritability is usually a sign of increased stress chemicals as well, because that's the design for what it's designed for in the old days. Depression's often once you have stress chemicals for longer, you will probably be more prone to depression. And in depression, we have changes in our hypothalamus, which change our appetite, our mood, and also our sleep. And it's not always, it's sometimes increased and sometimes reduced. So as we know, some people who have stress, they sleep more, and some people sleep less, especially once they get depressed. Some people will eat more and some people will eat less. So it's not necessarily, you know, not everyone just gains weight or loses weight. We're all a little different. Then we have episodes, and as the studies show, we have episodes for life. And with depression, major depression, the average number is 13. With anxiety, what we find in the literature is that people who have it at day one, about 70% will have it in a year, and in 10 years, still 50-odd% of people will still be troubled by it. So this is the sort of the jigsaw pieces that I've looked at. And when we look at symptoms, the other thing is that people with depression really don't have it alone. They usually always have some insomnia, some anxiety, sometimes panic attacks, and these things wax and wane. And often, you know, one day you might present with a panic attack, and then, you know, 6 months later you might be depressed. But they're comorbid. And so what we do find is that people who have depression will also have aspects of insomnia and anxiety. And one study showed that if you sleep well, you can not get depressed pretty much. And so sleep is a major barometer in terms of the activity of your stress nervous system. And I like to explain to patients is that when we look at symptoms, what we're looking at is electricity in the brain. And so we may say the reticular formation near the brainstem may code for sleep. And when you have increased electricity, we have wakefulness and insomnia. And when we have reduced electricity, we may have sleep. For anxiety, panic attack, and irritability, the amygdala is the center that may code for those things, and increased electricity can give you symptoms, and reduced electricity might give you less symptoms. And the same with pain, but we may look to the sensory cortex for pain. And for epilepsy, the motor cortex. And so I think it's quite a nice way to explain it to patients, and it's not too far from the truth either. And one of the things that we know is that the stress chemicals, noradrenaline and serotonin, have widespread connections in the brain. So they're actually flooding the brain with electricity in large parts of the brain to subserve the fight-flight response. And hence, the symptoms of stress, may include depression, but then you may also get some gut symptoms. And when you have a stress response, the blood flow to your gut reduces 40%, and digestive enzymes reduce 40%. So that well explains some of the gut symptoms that occur with stress-related disorders. When the stress chemicals attach to the sensory cortex, they can create headache symptoms. With the motor cortex, they can create worsening of tremors. They can increase epilepsy. So we've got sort of a system that seems to affect the whole body and most systems in the body. And it's well placed to do that for survival, albeit nowadays
Hi everyone, I'm hoping that you can hear me. It seems that we've just had a wee technical glitch. Giresh, you have frozen. Can anybody hear me? If you can give me a thumbs up, if you can give me a reaction down the bottom. Yep, okay, cool, all right. It seems that Giresh's link has just dropped out, so I'm sure in one moment he will be rejoining us. Let me see. Sorry about that, the joys of Zoom. I'm glad that we are all still here. So I'll take this moment to just talk about Giresh's book, which I'm sure that he will bring up. Hopefully you can see that. Brain Connections, fantastic read, very easy to understand. It's in layperson's speak. So yeah, I highly recommend it, and he will no doubt talk about where you can get hold of a copy of that book. And as I mentioned, we've also got additional workshops coming up with Giresh. So one of them is the 13th of February next year, and that's on how to manage depression for life. So this will be, we're looking to hold 2 workshops. So one is certainly for practitioners and GPs and those in the health sector, as well as those with across the broader spectrum. So we'll keep you informed on that as well. Now, let me see where Giresh is at. Okay, no, he's obviously having a little bit of trouble coming back in. So, oh, sorry, the date is the 13th of February, 2021. And it will be a 3-hour webinar running from 9 AM through to 11 AM. As I say, it's that one is aimed at health professionals, and that's why we've chosen it to be on a Saturday morning rather than during the week where people have got clients and coming through. So, and the lovely Natalie has just put up the link. Thank you, Natalie. Now, what I might do is just see where our lovely Giresh has got to. So, we won't be a moment, people. Thank you for bearing with us. I know this is a bit of a bother.
You know, they'll have an episode of depression, they may get more depressed, and then they may commit suicide. But I suspect what happens at some time in that chain, they probably have been to the health professional. It may not be that just the period prior to them committing suicide. That's all.
Right.
Well,
Yeah.
I don't know if that's I mean, I'm sure there are. I think in terms of depression and mood, underlying mood, I think many people actually don't, they hide it. It's sort of an underlayer where they sort of might cope well with their lives, but underneath there's a disconnect between their actions and their feelings underneath. And so I think that's a real thing that a lot of people that we find do take their lives, you think, oh gosh, it's a complete surprise. You wouldn't, yeah, and this maybe Robin Williams is someone that we may all look at thinking, oh, you know, he's a comedian, he's a happy-go-lucky guy. And so, but no one would really know what's going on underneath the surface.
Right, yes, yeah. A particular question about New Zealand research shows that there is an alarming rise in mental distress for young people. Given the impacts of COVID-19 and the rise in unemployment and the lack of hope for the future, how can we protect and enhance our young people in particular, regardless of our changing environment? Yeah,
I think this is going to be a problem in that we are, I think probably on the whole, New Zealand has done relatively well with respect to jobs. But I think if you're a young person at university now, trying to get a degree and coming into the workforce over the next year or so, or two, it's going to be a difficult job, I believe, as there's just not going to be the number of jobs out there. And I think the other thing here also is overseas. A lot of New Zealanders will go to Australia or they'll go to London or somewhere else to work. And I think that avenue will probably dry up as well. And, you know, there may be some economic answers which are different. But in terms of for our children, I think we need to instill on them habits to keep their mental health, to keep their sympathetic nervous system and brains in check. And I think that's probably the answers we can give them. And I'm going to talk about this in the next part of this, of the solutions to the problem. And I think those solutions the young people need to be made aware of. And I think I think as adults and parents, of all the parents out there, we need to model that behavior for our children, as well as perhaps enable them to do it, say with a gym membership or something like that, so they've got access to be able to do things that they enjoy, sports. Yeah.
Absolutely. And it's also understanding the role of drugs and alcohol, the effects of those on our young people and their link with depression and ongoing lifelong habits.
Yeah, I think and it's quite interesting, but the research on addiction shows exactly the same phenomenon as for depression, in that the more childhood traumas, the more likely you are to have an addiction disorder and be addicted to alcohol and drugs. So in fact, it seems that if you have a wound up stress brain, you're more likely to become addicted to something, possibly to forget your life, you know, as at the moment. So they do go a little bit hand in hand. And yeah.
Cool. I'm just reading through some of the others. And what about the role of hormones in depression?
There may be a role in some areas, and you know, maybe when you go through menopause, you're used to having estrogen for a good 20-30 years regularly pumped into your body, and then suddenly it drops, and so that could create some sort of withdrawal reaction that may lead to a bit of, and the poor sleep associated with it. However, on the whole, it's probably, let me illustrate this. So let's, pregnant woman in postnatal depression, right? We may think hormones, and there was a study done which followed women from around 36 weeks who were not depressed, and followed them till about 20 weeks postpartum. And what they did was measure their depression scores, their sleep scores, and their hormones. What they found was that for every 1 point increase in sleep disturbance score, their depression rates increased 25%. But it had no relationship to the hormonal changes during childbirth and afterwards. So I think, although hormones may be one factor, I suspect our stress, brains and sleep, and there's other more important factors.
Cool, thank you. A very good question has come in from Emma. Is there any evidence that there are common traits that lead to suicide where it occurs within the same family, or any psychological similarities?
Look, I don't know if someone's getting at the genetics of it, whether it's hereditary or something like that, but I think I suspect there's so many conditions that, or so many baseline factors that would sort of give rise to insomnia, anxiety, depression, poor mood, and some of those will be financial stability. Some of those might be the job you do, whether you love it or don't love it, and so. And I think this is, people ask me about back pain and they're, oh, is it hereditary? Because look, my father had it, my sister's got it. I think it's just that it's common, and that, that actually that if one family member gets it or is depressed for a while, it's going to affect the whole family anyway. So the chance of another family member getting it, and there may be some underlying factors for the whole family, including their prosperity and other things that may lead to poor, stress. Yeah. And the other thing is, if mum was wound up, and each baby that's born is going to be wound up.
Okay.
Is that genetic? I think it's probably more.
So it's more environmental rather than that predisposition to. Yeah.
There's probably both operating.
Yeah.
But I think unless we, so unless we've understood the whole A to Z of how this happens, we sometimes make assumptions about it's being hereditary or being environmental.
We are complicated beings.
Yes.
Cool. Okay, so with possible legalization of recreational cannabis, how does cannabis affect depressed people? What's your take on that?
Look, cannabis is, and I prescribe medicinal cannabis for chronic pain. It's very, very useful. It's actually, the uses for it are that it's good for neuropathic pain. There's been studies showing that. It actually helps people sleep as well. So some of my chronic pain patients take it just for sleep. So, I think it's like anything. For medications, each person's an individual and they have an individual response. Right. So it really is about finding the right medication for you. And hence for some people, that may be in the future that medical marijuana helps people sleep. And if it helps them sleep, their mood may improve. So, there may be a role for it.
Okay, yeah. I know in your book, you've talked a lot about non-drug, the strategies that you can easily put into place in day-to-day life rather than swaying towards drug options to manage sleep. I think that's all part of it.
Yeah, I think for me, it's about using all the tools in the toolbox.
Yeah.
Right? It really is. And it's about having that toolbox at your disposal because medications are really good when you look at them because they're pretty cheap in most Western countries. They're easy. They don't take any time. And so, sometimes intermittently you just need them so that it gets you back on track quicker.
Sure.
So I think I don't really, although a lot of my research looks at simple self-treatments for life, medications certainly have a role and they can be very useful as adjuncts. I think, however, sometimes you know, should we get on to the solutions? Because
Yes, do. Yes, sorry.
Let me share my screen. Now, if there are questions out there, I can go in later and type some answers for some of the questions we don't quite get through, okay? Yeah, so.
Is the screen sharing?
Yeah, I'm just about to.
Cool. Lovely.
Alrighty.
All good.
Okay.
Yeah. All right. Thumbs up.
And one of my interests is looking at problems such as depression and looking at the A to Z of it so that we can get points at which we can cut. And if it's a circular thing, the more intervention points we have, the better, because we can do several things at once to try and improve things. So it sounds obvious that reducing sympathetic tone may be a good idea, and that's reducing the activity of our stress nervous system. And implicated in that is reducing the size of our pituitary gland and our adrenal gland. And fortunately, it's all reversible. So the changes that occur in the brain and body for people who have prolonged stress and depression are reversible. And I think that's really awesome, because it just means the prognosis for people can be very good long term. The other thing we may want to do is increase GABA levels so that we can, the 20% of the brain that turns the electricity off can be invoked to relax the brain, pretty much. So we sort of want to go from this guy to this guy, or this lady, or whatever, this person to this person, really. That's to some degree. And then we shouldn't have too many problems. Now, the solutions aren't just in reducing the activity of the stress nervous system either, because we're sort of biopsychosocial beings. And what I've presented today is sort of more the biological brain part of depression and stress. However, if we, and so things like talk therapies, psychological therapies, mindfulness, counseling, they're very good. But often I find that they're going to be way more effective if we unwind our brains first. Because if our brains are sort of working with a lot of electricity, what we find, it's like a computer where the memory is jammed up and we don't really have enough brain power to process things that have happened to us or process how we could change our lives. And I sort of think it akin to running a little treadmill. When you're on that little treadmill, you can't really quickly step aside your life and think, okay, well, what's going on here? How do I look at things and try and affect long-term change to make my life better for the long term? And so, the talk therapies have a place, a huge place, but I often think that it's possibly better once people have done 3 months of something to unwind their stress nervous system so they're a bit calmer. And with a lot of things that happen to us, we often take them, we put them inside, in here somewhere, and then every day we operate with all this baggage inside. And we sort of, sometimes we'll flare up at something someone says or does, and we're not really, it's not really, we're sort of getting angry at what that has happened, but it's sort of a whole lot of baggage inside that makes us react adversely. So it's really good to get it all out, lay it on the table and process it to some degree. We need to also improve our social world. We are social beings and we need connection. We need to be, well connected with our family, whānau, whoever that is. And in a global world, it can be a bit difficult with people moving around a lot. And, like Johan Hari has written on, improving the social world and connection to improve depression, and it sure can do that. So sometimes we can improve any one of these aspects to improve something else. So we're pretty liquid. We want to look at our stresses, how much we work, how much time we have to do the habits that reduce the activity of our stress nervous system, relaxation, family time, etc. That's obvious but pretty useful. And then we want to have a toolbox. We might have a few sleeping tablets for when things go a bit awry. We might have some psychosocial groups that we've joined, so that we've got regular interaction and things like that. So, although I'm talking about the biological part of depression today mostly, we do need to look at these other factors in the longer term to improve our resilience long term. So with the sympathetic nervous system, why are the over 65 the happiest people in the world? And the answer to that is the sympathetic nervous system, the cells in our spinal cord that code for stress, reduced by 40% at around the age of 65, 70. And this will explain a little bit why fathers can be sometimes pretty, aggressive beings, and grandfathers, they can become grandfathers that are more sedate, let's say. And that's because there is this decline, and it's probably because people didn't live long enough, and we only need this system to fight tigers as well. And I had a really interesting case to illustrate this. In fact, once about 10 years ago, or maybe 20 years ago, I had a person who was around 40, and I read his case notes before I saw him, and he'd been plagued with depression and aggressive behavior and run-ins with the law and poor relationships. And he came to see me, and when he saw me, he appeared very, very different from the notes. He just was very pleasant, placid, sort of calm person, came with his daughter, and it was quite surprising. And what I found out was that about 5 years ago, he tried to kill himself with a nail gun. He was a roofer. And what he did was he shot himself basically in the pituitary gland and stopped producing stress chemicals. And it's a true story. And so, his brain didn't signal the production of stress chemicals 5 years ago. And all of a sudden, he'd been out of the mental health system for 5 years. He'd had no problems with depression or aggression, and he was a calm, pleasant, relatively happy person. So it's not the cure I'd advocate, but it illustrates the story about stress chemicals. Now, compared to Liverpool, it's a lot warmer in Spain than in England, as we all know. And we know that heat reduces sympathetic tone. Now, can you still hear me, guys?
Hi, yep, you are freezing up a little bit, just coming and going.
Yep.
Yes, yep.
Right. So one of the things is heat reduces sympathetic nervous system tone and relaxes us. And at the age of 40, when I did my PhD, I in fact started going to the sauna. And once I found this out, I went to the sauna 2 or 3 times a week and started doing some hot yoga. And prior to that period of time, I was always very active. I used to play hockey, run, cycle, kayak most days, had 2 kayaks, and I lived in Seaton and Wellington. And I still used to have nightmares and night sweats, maybe 2 or 3 times a week. When I started going to the sauna, however, and the heat, all of a sudden, the tension neck at the end of the working day, after seeing patients, and my sleep started to improve, and that I didn't really experience, they just became a lot less often. So, so heat is a real strategy for people with stress-related disorders, including depression. And in Japan, they've studied heat and sympathetic tone and found that 5 days a week in 4 weeks, your sympathetic nervous system activity can reduce. And so I often explain this to patients, and they can do 20 minutes in the sauna, spa, or hot bath. And that's a really useful strategy. Lately, with lockdown, I've thought of other strategies, and one strategy has been using an electric blanket, putting it on high during the day and laying in it for 20-30 minutes and doing some breathing while you're lying in the electric blanket. And that's a very, very cheap and easy form of heat and trying to relax the brain, which someone can do every day. So as I said, I'm after usually simple sort of self-therapies. During the last lockdown, I had a bath every day for 20 minutes. And because the gym was closed, and usually I'd go down to the Onehunga pool and gym complex and usually do a bit of a workout and go and heat up in the spa or sauna 4 or 5 days a week minimum. And so heat is a very useful intervention. Exercise is another intervention, and it seems that the more rigorous the exercise, the better. And this may relate to the tiger. We see the tiger. Do we just walk away? No, we often sprint, run, and fight. And so the studies do show that 20 minutes of intense exercise or 40 minutes of moderate exercise is beneficial to reducing stress nervous system activity and also depression. And here's one of the charts from one of the studies, and it's a phenomenal result. You know, the Beck Depression Inventory score just plummets into the non-depressed range, and it stays there. So, and this is for weightlifting or aerobic exercise such as running. The same studies have been done for swimming. So, you know, and I think people will say, oh yeah, but depressed people don't, you know, they don't want to exercise. And that can be true. But quite often we pick up these patients in times of, you know, deep depression, and sometimes in times of moderate depression, and sometimes they're feeling good. So often it's a little wave like this. And whenever I see patients for chronic pain or stress, you know, I'll look at their history, and if, you know, so many of them are on an antidepressant, you know, even 5 years later, they're just on it. And, you know, that's a nice point to intervene and say, hey, look, you've been taking this, what happened? Do you have a bit of depression or something in the past? You know, hey, look, and so that, you know, so I think we can intervene with people when they're well to save them getting another episode and create a habit for life. And that's sort of where, you know, where I think we can probably help a lot of people. And to this end, I think with our children, as I said, I model that for my children, and now wherever my children are, they basically will go to the gym or swim or do something regularly. And I think it's just, we're animals, and it's something we really have to do to maintain our health. Meditation, breathing. Meditation is helpful because it increases our GABA levels in our brain, the chemical that suppresses electricity and calms the brain. And when I was finishing Brain Connections, just at the tail end of it, I came across 2 studies. And one of them showed that meditation versus reading a book quietly, the meditation increased GABA levels. Meditation versus watching television, the meditation increased GABA levels more. So I actually started doing some breathing meditation, and I used to lie on my bed with eyes closed, and I'd put my my phone on a timer, sometimes 10 minutes, then 20 minutes, and build it up because it's quite hard sometimes to do it. And what I would do is actually I'd breathe in for 5 seconds and out for 5 seconds. And what actually happens is when we breathe in slowly and stretch our lungs, we actually increase our parasympathetic nervous system tone, which is our relaxation nervous system. When we breathe out slowly, we actually reduce the activity of our sympathetic nervous system. So breathing in slowly and out slowly is scientifically excellent to reduce the activity of our stress brain. And so I used to just lie down and count to 5, 1, 2, 3, slowly and out. So you can, it's quite nice to make these activities, you know, just a-religious, so, you know, everyone can participate. And I think advising people of the scientific reasons why these things work is quite helpful. It's like, you know, because often people will come along, oh, why should I do this? And if we can explain it to patients, I think they're more likely to engage in the behavior. So now I often give this exercise for people to lay in the electric blanket. So if they don't have access to a gym, live in the rural sector where they can't have hot baths every day because of water supply, you know, there's a lot of barriers, and it's about reducing barriers. So this is probably one of the simplest things that someone can do. And for anyone who's meditated out there, I did meditation for about a year, and I still do it occasionally, but not as often. And what I found initially was it took 20 minutes, and after 20 minutes, the whole brain just goes blank. And it's actually quite a blissful feeling. And it's just, and I think it's scientifically, the GABA chemicals are being released after 20 minutes or so, depending on the state of your mind. And then they basically just blank all the electricity. And that's it's quite a nice scientific, it probably is science of it, but it's a very useful thing for people to do, and it's free. So at Auckland University, I'm working with the engineering school at the moment to develop a sensor and an app and on your phone. So we've got a sensor that connects to your finger or your ear. It measures your stress brain, heart rate variability, connects to your phone, and it also measures respiratory rate. So we've been working on that for the last year or two to try and produce a simple device for people to roll out into the community, into general practices and other areas to help people with stress-related conditions.
That's really exciting. Yeah,
it is very exciting. And I think there are, it's nice to have a sort of cause and a cure. And I think it's not, and the good thing about researching for this book is, 10 years ago, I was mainly an advocate for going to the sauna and heat therapies because they were on my radar. And then once I researched this book, I found out the greater spectrum of things that are available for people that work. And so Tai Chi is also another modality that's been proven to reduce the activity of the stress nervous system, and there's studies showing that it improves depression as well. So the flavor of it is pretty good. Yoga the same. They've done studies to put yoga against against swimming, and it was an hour a day for 5 days a week for about 8 weeks, and both reduce the activity of the stress nervous system, and both can improve depression as well. And when we think about it, the commonality is probably breathing. So when we do Tai Chi and yoga, we are sort of breathing slowly and deeply and breathing out slowly. And we're also doing some balancing activities, etc. But I suspect the breathing is in large part the reason why these activities relax our brains. 1 hour, 4 or 5 days a week is usually required for yoga meditation, and Tai Chi. That dose would be a reliable dose if you have stress-related problems. I suspect as you unwind your brain, modify your lifestyle to lead a more relaxed lifestyle, you probably can get away with less as you've got less input. Medications work on the neurotransmitters in our brain. They basically work on the noradrenaline, the serotonin, sometimes antihistamine, etc. And what they do is they often reduce electricity in parts of our brain, some increase electricity in parts of our brain. That's how they work. They create side effects because they work on other parts of our brain too. And that's why people will get an effect that is unwanted. In terms of the studies, antidepressants have the unfortunate rap of increasing the activity of our stress nervous system. For most of the antidepressants do that. Now that's quite contrary to what we probably want to achieve, is a more relaxed brain. So I think, in short term, they work relatively well. 60 to 65% of people can be not depressed after sort of 2 to 6 weeks. However, in the long term, at 10 months, their effectiveness wanes off a little bit and is less than exercise in head-to-head studies. So although it can be helpful short term, in the long term, the habits are probably going to be more sustainable. Sleeping tablets are helpful in that when you do go to sleep, your stress nervous system does a big dip, right? And if you don't sleep well, it doesn't have a big dip. So it almost goes into reverse mode, your stress brain. That's why sleep is instrumental in managing stress-related conditions and keeping people from getting depressed again, is making sure they sleep well. And so that we can prescribe tablets for. and I do prescribe tablets a lot. And I say to them, hey, look, here are the habits, see how you go. Here's some tablets to get you on your way. And hopefully, as the months roll on, we replace the tablets with the habits, right? But it's no use stopping the tablets if they haven't attained a habit. So we need to be open-minded about everything. Mood-modifying tablets, anti-epileptics are also used in lithium. So there's a range of medications that are used, and they can be very useful. And I think we don't need to, we need to be aware of them. Yeah, we need to work together with doctors who prescribe them and GPs so that, we're just using all the tools in the toolbox. Because it's likely if someone comes to you, they're not sleeping, they've got depression, then, we want to cut them at the sleep. We want to, cut them at the mood. We want to educate them on how they got there. So I believe when people understand what's happening to them, I think they can, it's much easier, much easier to break the cycles and to buy into the management plan. But yeah, and why they should do things. And I think the other thing is patients won't always pick up the habits, but it's surprising, some people go, oh, yeah, look, I've been exercising a few times a week and I've increased it. And it's more like giving them a pat on the back. Hey, that's great. You've started the habit. And then, maybe just add one more time or a week or something like that. And I've had a lot of patients who, have gone to the pool 5 days a week and they actually go for years. And I see them even years later, often at the local public swimming pools in Wellington, and I see them and they basically are still going. And so so a lot of people can develop habits for life, but we need to, if they understand the problems, then hopefully, they can do it in their time, and at least they know what to do. And I think my job and our job is to, for health professionals, is impart the knowledge to where they hopefully understand it, and hopefully the behaviour changes over time.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So it's a time for change, I think, in the way we manage these things. And that I think the change is also, there's a few things, but people need to own their problems completely and utterly. And I think this is the shift that we need to make, is that, hey, you own your problem. I can give you some outline of how it happened and the solutions to your problem, but it really is your problem, and you are the only person in the world that can change it. And I think, and sometimes they can't change it and they need some help, like they may need funding for a swimming pool or stuff like that. And I think the government can step in to help. And I think one of the government initiatives that I'd like to see happen nationwide is, swimming pools are made free for people on benefits or people with health problems in the stress-related field, so they can go between the hours of, say, 12 and 2, when maybe the swimming pool is not used at an odd hour, and it's free for people to go who have the time and need to go. And that would be very helpful, because even the $3 to $4 is a barrier for people to go, and if it was free for them, they may go more regularly. Yeah. So in public transport, the same, making public transport free for them at certain times so they can get to the swimming pools, is a great idea. We'd probably save a lot of money by buying gym memberships for depressed people, and some gyms are $1 a day. That would probably be much more cost effective in the long term for our mental health than some of the strategies we can't fund.
Mm. Totally.
I'm happy to take questions if there are, or I don't know how we're going for time.
Well, we're now at 1:05, so a bit over time, but we did have that down, technical glitch. So we've had some fantastic questions come through. Let me just, does taking antidepressant medication repair or protect the brain from the increases in size gain?
Increase in the stress nervous system, is that?
Yeah.
No,
does taking antidepressant medication repair or protect the brain?
It's more likely to harm the brain.
Right, yeah.
Because it increases the activity of the stress nervous system in the longer term, many antidepressants. So, some of them have proven to probably increase our risk of things in the future rather than reduce them.
Right.
Same as antipsychotics, and hence people who are taking antipsychotics long term, they have a lot of problems, including early death, things like that.
Okay. Okay. For those that have recurring anxiety around particular actions in their life, what would be the best response to addressing something like long-term driving anxiety?
I think it may be many things, but I suspect reducing the activity of their stress nervous system may allow behavioral therapy or something to change the way they feel about driving, or what the barrier has been. So I think with a lot of the expressions of phobias and things like that, they're often because stress is locked in the brain, but events are also locked in our bodies, that they connect up and think, oh no, I don't want to do that because maybe I've had a car accident or something like that's happened. So I think probably the first step would be to unwind the brain so that they're calmer, and then try and do some therapeutic work to check exactly why they don't want to drive and see if we can unlock that and process that.
Yeah, good as gold. Great. Perhaps just one more. Why do you think it is that depression, the statistics of women are overrepresented when it comes to depression?
Good question, and I should have explained that. Women produce a third more stress chemicals for any ever given input.
Oh.
Yeah, so that's why they get more headaches. That's why they get more probably, I suspect they get more insomnia, anxiety, and depression but I know they get more depression.
Right.
So they actually produce more stress chemicals. I suspect it's part of nurturing, and that it's almost like, the cold hands, warm heart, right? And that's actually a real thing, because stress chemicals go to your hands and constrict blood vessels, so you get cold hands. So for people out there with cold hands, cold feet, that's a sign of an overactive stress nervous system.
Mm-hmm.
But it makes them more compassionate.
Gotcha.
I suspect that in terms of survival, we want the maternal instinct is coded in many ways.
Very good. Well, I think that with that, we should do a bit of a wrap. I'm sort of conscious of the time now. We're coming up to 1:10. Thank you all so much for joining us this afternoon, everyone. And thank you too for your patience when we did have that wee technical
Sorry
glitch.
about that. Yeah.
It's all good. As I say, I will be in touch with information on the next webinar and workshops that Giresh will be holding. Also, I'll share Giresh's slides today, and information on where you can purchase his book, which is absolutely fantastic, as I said earlier. A really good, easy read, easy to understand, and great practical tips and strategies in there. So, ngā mihi nui, and thank you, Giresh. Thank you so much for sharing your slides, sharing your information. Just fantastic.
Thanks to Grow, and thanks, Faye, and thank you everyone for turning up. It's a pleasure.
Wonderful. Super. Well, have a great afternoon, everyone. And thanks for being a part of Mental Health Awareness Week. Cheers. That was super. So, there we go.